Spawn may be powerless and mortal, but that's not going to get in the way of him kicking ass and taking names. And we're going to talk all about it right here in our review of King Spawn number 31. See you in 3. And welcome back to Comical Opinions. This is our review of King Spawn number 31. And in this issue, a local woman gets kidnapped by supernatural gangsters who are also powerless, and they decide to set up Spawn to take the fall and eliminate the competition. But before we get started, please like, share, comment, subscribe, hit that bell for notification. Your attention is greatly appreciated, and stay tuned to the end of the review for the rating and score. So let's talk about the credits before we get into the meat of the issue. King Spawn number 31 from Image Comics is written by Todd McFarlane. Art by Jeremy Hawn, new to us. This is the first time we're seeing his work. Colors by Ivan Nunez, still one of the best colors around. Letters by And World Design, and the main cover A, is drawn by Javi Fernandez. No relation to Gunslinger Spawn, who's also named Javi. Okay, so let's talk about what happened in the previous issue, which is really not the previous issue, but it's really Spawn number 350, which was the culmination of all the Spawnverse titles coming together. A new character is on the throne of hell. Hint, we're going to spoil a little bit, but not all the way. It's not Spawn. So a new character is on the throne of hell, and in retribution for all the angst and turmoil and drama and death and anxiety and all the problems that was created by the Heaven-Hell War, the characters snap their fingers, send everybody back to Earth in separate corners and all over the place. And when they arrive, they found out that the dead zones on Earth have all grown and merged and melded with each other, so now the entire Earth is a dead zone. What does that mean? That means all the Spawn characters now have no powers and are mortal and just like everybody else. Their brains are intact, their fighting skills are intact, but effectively they're just humans. So that's the big deal, and that's a pretty big game changer for everybody else. So now we pick up with the individual titles where everybody's adjusting to their new status quo. Spawn, maybe not so much. So let's talk about what happens in this issue. Spawn still wears the cape, still wears the costume, and his face is pretty much back to normal for what it should be as a human, but he has no powers. He has no... His cape doesn't do anything. He doesn't have any necroplasmic energy to wield. He's just a normal guy. And so when we find out, he stalks, I should say, and hunts down a local tough guy henchman to find out what happened to Mrs. Blake. And Mrs. Blake, we find out in a flashback, has been kidnapped, and she's a salt of the earth kind of person. She goes to church, everybody loves her, she's a pillar of the community, and she's been kidnapped. And what we find out after the fact is that spiritual entities, folks that were demons or some kind of monstrous figure from hell, now are also mortal. They're no longer demons, they don't have any powers, they don't have any heightened physical capabilities, but now they're just effectively just gangsters. And so we have corporate organizations, corrupt corporate organizations, and organized crime families that are making moves and trying to vie for power and position to make sure that even though they're stuck on Earth and they're human and they look like everybody else, they're not going to be left holding the bag as far as not being able to live the best life that they can, and they're not going to be they're not going to take any hits for revenge or anything else that has anything to do with the Heaven-Hell War. But they're still pretty terrible people. So what they do is they decide to kidnap Mrs. Blake, knowing that Spawn is not going to stand for it. And Spawn, in proper Spawn fashion, starts making his way through the criminal underlings, working his way up the chain to find out what happened to Mrs. Blake. So in effect, the kidnapping was essentially a setup to force Spawn to start eliminating the competition for the former demons who are now effectively organized crime gangsters. And that's it in a nutshell. Now, what's interesting in the middle of this is there are still supernatural creatures running around. For example, Spawn kidnaps one of the henchmen and uses, how should we say, very strong intimidation tactics by putting him in a cage with a chained up vampire. So vampires are still around. So vampires are still real. They're still a creature to be feared and somebody you want to stay away from. So that he allows them to essentially use him as a dog on a chain to force the guy to talk. and it ends pretty badly for this particular henchman. But what that also gives us a little bit of a hint that supernatural creatures still exist on Earth. The dead zones don't take everything away from everybody that has some kind of connection to the supernatural. So that's an interesting little hint, something that may come into play later on. So we'll see how it goes. Now, interesting tidbit, King Spawn number 31 actually is a sister issue, if you want to call that, to Gunslinger Spawn number 29. The two have references to each other. Gunslinger Spawn does more to reference King Spawn than the reverse, but they sort of pair up together because they're coming out in the same week, which that makes sense, and they both rely heavily on the events coming out of Spawn number 350. So the interesting fact of this particular issue, even though it works as a standalone, it does borrow elements from other titles, and everything comes out of Spawn 350. So this is almost a completely new start to the series, even though it's issue 31. So something you want to consider of picking up the titles together to bring them to make a more complete story. So what do we think about King Spawn number 31? Interesting setup. It's good to see Spawn status quo after the events of 350, after the snap from the new king. He almost doesn't care, if that makes sense. So it's kind of impressive to see that Spawn, even though he's not immortal, he doesn't have his powers, his chains and his cape don't move on their own, and all these things that are happening are all gone. He's still an intimidating factor. People still talk about him as somebody you don't want to mess with, from the lowest criminals to the most high up former demons. They know he's not somebody you mess with. And so that's kind of impressive that his reputation precedes him to that strong degree. Even when they recognize he's now mortal, they still don't want to mess with him in any respect. So that's good character building. It's good world building. And Todd McFarlane, who's the writer, really puts Spawn on a new mission, almost irrespective of what happened out of 350. It's almost like it doesn't matter. Even though it matters, it almost doesn't matter. And so that kind of speaks to his Spawn as a character. And the mission is kind of interesting, is how far can they use Spawn to enact, how these gangster organizations to enact their will and try to eliminate the competition, and how far can that go? So that's kind of an interesting development. That's probably something we haven't seen before. I want to see where that goes. On the downside, what's not so great about King Spawn number 31, we don't get enough of the connection between Spawn and Mrs. Blake to understand how he's motivated to kind of go to put himself at risk to find out where she is and where she's been kidnapped. She can't be the only person in the city or in the surrounding area that's been kidnapped or been harmed or been lost or missing in some way. So the two, Mrs. Blake's kidnapping and Spawn's mission to find her, they're connected obviously, but at the same time McFarlane doesn't really make the connection about how the two know each other. Now, I'm sure that's been brought up in previous issues, but it would have been nice to see a little bit of something of how Al knows Mrs. Blake and then why he's so determined to get her back. That's not to say it's a wrong thing, but at the same time, it sort of is very, very much zeroing in on that one act to draw Spawn into a risky, dangerous situation, and the connection isn't quite there. So what do we think of the art? Let's talk about the art. So this is the first time we've seen artwork from Jeremy Haun. We'll say it, how should we put it? It's okay. It's not up to the typical Spawn-verse standards. Just put it like that. So for example, we just reviewed Carlo Barberi in Gunslinger Spawn number 29. That is very typical for Spawn titles in the Todd McFarlane Image Comics realm of art. It looks good, fantastic lines, interesting character movements, so much dynamicism and movement and just characters standing still. That's what you should see. That's what we're used to seeing. Jeremy Haun, not so much. It looks very much like a publisher you'd see something like a Scout or maybe a Red 5 Comics or something like that. It's not bad art. It's just not at the same level of quality. The characters look stiff. There's a lot of, I would say, reference drawing, which means not tracing, but drawing from static photographs. And the art feels very static. It's not nearly as energetic and dynamic as we're used to seeing. It's okay art, not great art. And it was kind of surprising to see that, because Todd McFarlane never lets a Spawn book go out that looks less than it could be. This looks less than it could be, so it's kind of a surprise. I'm not trying to be down on Jeremy Haun, but this is not up to standards for what we're used to for a Spawn title. The colors look great, or from Ivan Nunes, which is what you expect, but Jeremy Hahn is presenting a different style that's not quite up to par for what we're used to seeing. Okay, so final thoughts. What do we think of King Spawn number 31? The conflict is interesting. Spawn presents as the ultimate badass, which is kind of impressive and kind of heartwarming to see when you consider he doesn't have his powers and he's mortal. Discovering how Spawn's laser-focused and guided missile mission to rescue Mrs. Blake, how that plays out, considering he has no powers and subject to physical harm, is kind of going to be interesting to see. So there's a lot of anticipation and curiosity to find out how that plays out. On the downside, the connection between Mrs. Blake's kidnapping and Spawn is not quite obvious, and the art is not up to the same par or level that we're used to seeing out of the Spawn comic from Image. So having said that, we're going to give our score. We're going to give King Spawn number 31 sorry to say it, we're going to give him a 6.8 out of 10. Could be better on multiple fronts. It's okay plot-wise, but everything else around it needed to be a little bit better. So 6.8 out of 10 for King Spawn number 31. Hope you enjoyed this review. If you want to hear or listen to or watch more reviews just like this one, please stay tuned through the outro.